What if Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man was the MCU Spider-Man? What if way back when in 2012, when the Avengers came out and the Amazing Spider-Man came out, that somehow Marvel and Sony were able to come up with some type of agreement to merge Andrew Garfield into the MCU? This actually almost happened. There were talks that Marvel and Sony were considering to have the Oscorp building in the backdrop of New York as a bit of an Easter egg for the Avengers to sort of foreshadow Spider-Man being in the MCU. This Oscorp building was supposed to be the same one that we would see in Andrew Garfield's first Spider-Man movie. If they did end up coming to some type of agreement, the MCU would look very different, and the way we perceive Spider-Man today would look very different. So in this alternate timeline that we're talking about, where Andrew Garfield is still Spider-Man and there was never a Spider-Man played by Tom Holland, what would the actual story of Spider-Man look like? Well, we know that he wouldn't appear in the first Avengers movie because that was where the Oscorp Easter egg came into play. However, I think we can assume that S.H.I.E.L.D. would end up trying to contact him through Steve Rogers instead of the way it happened in the MCU, where Tony Stark went himself to go talk to Peter Parker, because there was a better chance that they would relate, because they were both kids that grew up in New York, and they ended up actually making that connection in Captain America Civil War. So this is how they would probably contact this version of Peter Parker. So Andrew Garfield gets his first Spider-Man movie in 2012, and then in 2014, The Amazing Spider-Man 2 would still happen. The events in that story would still play out very similarly, and Gwen Stacy would still end up dying. However, in this movie, we would get a little cameo from Steve Rogers, and this is when S.H.I.E.L.D. would go to contact Peter Parker. This is a version of Peter Parker that really is hesitant towards the idea of S.H.I.E.L.D. However, he does take a liking to Steve Rogers, and Steve Rogers becomes a mentor figure for him. He would go on to make brief appearances and cameos in other Marvel movies like Age of Ultron and Ant-Man and Doctor Strange, movies like that where he wouldn't even have to have that big of a role. In Age of Ultron, you could have a scene where he does help the Avengers in New York, but in other smaller films like Doctor Strange or Ant-Man, at that time it was 2015, 2016, Peter wouldn't really be a part of the story at all, but you could have Spider-Man casually swinging in New York City in the background. So in Age of Ultron, Tony Stark would then be introduced to Peter Parker, and obviously the two would get along. Peter Parker would really admire and look up to Tony Stark from a different way that he looks up to Cap, because he relates to Tony Stark through technology and through their brains, essentially. So while Peter related to Steve on a level that they were just kids that had these powers bestowed upon them, and they were given this responsibility to do what was right, Civil War and the whole conflict with the Sokovia Accords still happens, and Peter is torn between sides. He relates to Steve and understands why he won't sign the Accords. Even though Peter has come to terms with Gwen's death, he still feels responsible and blames himself, and he ultimately sides with Team Iron Man and believes heroes still need accountability. This would mirror Civil War in the comics. Spider-Man initially sides with Team Iron Man, and when the battle between Cap and Tony happens, Tony is beating Cap by a long shot, and it's not until Spider-Man steps in, much like Black Widow did in Civil War, that Cap is able to get the upper hand and defeat Iron Man. However, in this process, because Tony did help Peter create some modifications for his suit, he ends up shutting down his suit, where he can no longer shoot webbing, he can no longer use the interface in his mask. So Peter is going to have to go on the run with Team Cap without the technology of Tony Stark, and is going to be forced to create his own suit, which leads to Peter basically becoming his own man and creating his own Spider-Man suit himself, getting rid of the Tony Stark technology and just having to rely on his powers alone. If this specific part of the story happened, it would fix a lot of the problems that people have with Tom Holland's Spider-Man, where he relies too much on technology and is Iron Man Jr., a lot of people say. Now, whatever you think about that, I think this could be a different alternative where he does initially have Stark tech, but he ends up deciding to grow out of that and become his own man. So with Gwen Stacy dead in the MCU, MJ would be introduced. However, she would be more of a partner in crime, guy in the chair type character, where she's assisting him much like she assists him in the Marvel Spider-Man games. It wouldn't be till later on, further down the line in the MCU, that they would become love interests, because Peter would not feel right getting with MJ right off the bat after Gwen happened. As for the Andrew Garfield Spider-Man movies themselves, The Amazing Spider-Man 3 would still happen, and it would deal with the Clone Saga, with a character named Jackal who is obsessed with Gwen Stacy himself, tries to revive her by creating a living clone from Gwen's DNA. This would cause Peter Parker to have to fight his own demons, and this movie would set the precedent for clones being in the MCU. Also, by now, Sony would have made their Sinister Six movie, which basically would have been an origin story Suicide Squad style movie where this group of villains gets together. It's sort of a heist type movie where they would end up fighting this greater evil and end up becoming evil themselves, but also these characters are something that we can relate to, and they would end up becoming the main villains for future Spider-Man movies like The Amazing Spider-Man 4. In Infinity War, Tony and Peter would end up making up. That would be their arc for Infinity War. And then at the very end, the same thing happens with Peter Parker turning to dust, and then Tony Stark is dealt with that grief where he feels regret for everything that's happened and he just wants to make everything right. And this moment would feel much more impactful considering how much they've gone through throughout the years and how their relationship hasn't been perfect. It's been a rocky road, and I feel like this scene might have had even more weight than the one we got. For future Spider-Man movies past this point, there are an infinite amount of possibilities as to what could happen, because everything that I've told you so far has basically been what Sony wanted to happen in terms of Spider-Man's story and his arc. They wanted the Sinister Six to happen, they wanted the Clone Saga to happen, and they wanted MJ to happen. And I sort of wanted to integrate that story inside the MCU and see what would have happened if you plucked Andrew Garfield Spider-Man right at the beginning of the Avengers forming in the MCU and see what kind of domino effect that could have created on other characters. So if you guys have any other what if scenarios that you would like me to talk about, please let me know in the comments below. This one was super fun to make and theorize on, and it's my first one on this channel, so if you have any feedback, please feel free to let me know in the comments. That's enough out of me. I hope you guys have an amazing day, and I'll see you next time.